Greetings, virtual circuit riders. We're back together again, and we want to look at in this installment the theme of the globalization of Methodist mission. I use these terms precisely, the globalization of Methodist mission, because Methodism as a movement, both within the Wesleyan revival in Great Britain and in its engagement with the North American continent, both Canada and in America, was conceived as a missionary movement to spread scriptural holiness and to reform the nations, beginning with the churches. And so this mission, in essence, constituted the Wesleyan movement in all of its structural forms and expressions. But by 1819, it was recognized that with the growing wealth and the growing strength of institutional Methodism of the MEC in North America, some kind of extra conference mission needed to be exercised in terms of selecting candidates and financing ministries for areas that could not support the usual itinerant ministries. We've talked about that already in the work of John Stewart with the Native Americans in the Wyandotte in Ohio. And so in 1819, not as it says here, 1820, in 1819, the Methodist Mission Society was created to bring more administrative oversight to mission initiatives, primarily among the Wyandotte in the work of John Stewart, and then J.B. Finley, who was appointed as the regular itinerant minister there. And so this graphic here shows a stock certificate, a fundraising instrument used to raise money for the new mission society that really kicks into gear in 1820, but was founded officially in 1819. For the sum of $20, you have a lifetime membership in the mission society there. And you can see this vision of coming over to help the poor African and Native Americans that needed ministry. You can see both of these visions here of Christianity going forth to help the world. So now Methodism had a separate society for mission, and this really signaled a major shift in self-identity structurally for Methodism, which had seen all of its itinerant appointments and ministries as missionary. Now a separate, dedicated society for mission emerged, which had a way of dividing theologically the various notions of mission. And so this is about the institutionalization of Methodist mission, or compartmentalization, which we've had difficulty with ever since. Once we divorced mission from our common task together theologically, this compartmentalization has meant the experts have gone off to the Mission Society, or what is known as the General Board of Global Ministries today, and congregations have their own ministry logic and theology. In some ways, this has impoverished our sense of ministry orders as missionary orders, missionary appointments, and it's also weakened our sense of congregational call to a mission within an area or a neighborhood. We're appointed to churches now, not to circuits or to geographic areas for mission. And this is since the 1820s and Methodism's growing middle class wealth. All of the branches of the Methodist family after the split, at 1830 for the Methodist Protestants and 1845 for the MEC South, all had societies, and both men and women were able to serve in these societies after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, all branches of the Wesleyan family were active in mission, and this post-Civil War 19th century era is often seen as the high era, not only of Methodist mission, but of Protestant mission throughout the world, Catholics being active through the great age of exploration earlier in the 15th and 16th centuries. Okay, we want to look at some of the highlights of mission pioneer work. We've already shown the story and talked about the story of John Stewart, who really provokes the foundation of the Methodist Mission Society. And from 1819 really until 1833, most Methodist mission work, all of it, was confined to Native American work, and John Stewart is seen as the patron saint, if you will, of the formation of the Methodist Mission Society. Really an attempt by bishops to bring mission to Native Americans out of the hands of unlicensed preachers, and then later licensed preachers like John Stewart, and bring Native American mission back into under the authority of bishops. The need for bishops to exercise control over selection and appointment of missionaries around the world has been a theme filled with tension, not only for the Native American mission, but throughout Methodist history. Who will be authoritative? Who will oversee the mission work? What irregular forms of mission can be allowed to exist throughout the world for the sake of the promotion of the gospel? And John Wesley himself came down on the side that he could entertain the use of laity and other lay pastors and ministries for the sake of mission, and even ordaining for the sake of mission. Our logic of appointment and itineration and even ordination, the first ordinations that Wesley laid hands on with Watcote and Vasey, were because of the logic of sending preachers into mission fields without episcopal oversight, and therefore invading the right of no ecclesial authority. So when we no longer have this missionary call and theology wrapped around our missionary orders, it distances ourselves from Wesley's own clear notion that itinerant ordination within the Wesleyan family was a call to mission. So until 1833, the Native American mission was the primary form, until Melville B. Cox offered his services after the death of his wife and children to tuberculosis. He himself, probably contracting it, offers himself to begin a pioneer mission in Liberia. Looking back to our Google Earth map, Liberia is on the west coast of Africa, and you will note here that already by the time the first Caucasian missionary sent by officially the Methodist Mission Society in 1833, there had already been a First United Methodist Church in Monrovia, Liberia from 1822. And the story of that is told in our CD-ROM material. Repatriated freedmen and women from the American Colonization Society landed in March of 1822 out of the Baltimore area, and created their own settler church there from 1822. So you've got, again, unofficial, unlicensed preachers, in this case African Americans, returning home, returning to and trying to make a new home in Liberia that precedes Methodist mission official sent ministries by 11 years. Also, if you'll recall, the AME also entered both Sierra Leone and Liberia earlier in the work of Daniel Coker, a good 10 or 11 years before the Methodist Mission Society actually sent Cox there. You can look at the story. There's a lot of material there. Liberia was the first international official mission field for the Methodist Episcopal Church of the North, and it remained until the 1960s our largest. There were over 300 missionaries there in the 1960s, and when I arrived as a missionary there in 1995, there were only three missionary. There were only three missionaries left. I was sent to be a professor in the theological seminary there, and so this was during the Civil War, and so from being our first and greatest mission work, already by the 90s, the indigenization of Liberia meant that there were strong leadership there in place, and the Methodist Church has produced such great leaders as Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, a member of First UMC in Monrovia, Liberia, and she is the first female president of any African nation, doing a marvelous job at repairing that country after the Civil War and its destruction there. Melville B. Cox only lived 4 months, probably having tuberculosis, and then in conjunction with the malaria that he picked up from the mosquitoes that were prevalent on the coast, malarial vectors as they call them. He died after 4 months, but not after setting up the College of West Africa, which continues today as a secondary school, a high school that has trained many of the great leaders of Methodism there. He was the first Methodist martyr in Liberia of 1833, and he's buried there in Liberia. His last words were, "Let 1,000 fall before Africa be given up." And this was on his tombstone and also conveyed through the press back to, and through his letters back to the Methodist Mission Society. And this became the rallying cry for Methodist missions of the 1830s, let 1,000 fall. 1,000, not quite 1,000 fell, but others answered the call, and Anne Green Wilkins was the first official Methodist missionary sent by the Methodist Mission Society of 1836. She'd been a school teacher, had been abandoned by her husband, who she had a small amount of money, and she offered herself and her money to Nathan Bangs, the president of the Methodist Mission Society, at a camp meeting, and he accepted both her money, her own self-support, as it were, and her service. She served the longest of any 19th century missionary in Liberia, over 21 years, somehow miraculously surviving where so many of her colleagues, both Methodists and Presbyterians and other denominations, succumbed so often to malaria, to death by tuberculosis and pneumonia. She started a female school and began to train young women at the White Plains Institute in just northwest of Monrovia, where I lived, and we used to visit the White Plains area as a camp meeting quite often. Anne Green Wilkins was dedicated to taking young girls away from the promised marriage system, the dowry system, getting them educated before they were married off, often at the age of 12, and really set the stage for creating some of the first educated women in Liberia. Shifting scenes, we're still dealing with the Methodist Episcopal Church here of the North. This man here, Dwight Judson Collins, was the first Methodist missionary to China. 1847, graduate of University of Michigan. He went to the bishop and said, "Please send me to China. I have a call to work as a medical missionary there." And the bishop said, "We have no work there. How can I oversee you?" And he says, "That's the point. We want to establish work there." So Dwight Judson Collins paid his own freight, his own way, as it were, on a ship to China, and created, along with Dr. Moses White, the first MEC North mission. This was after the split, so this was a Northern Methodist mission. So Collins and the Northern Methodist mission comes in 1847 into southern China, the Fuzhou in the old way of saying it, Fuzhou in the newer version. You can see here is in our CD-ROM a long history here and you'll want to take a look at that. The Northern Church begins its work in 1847, and this immediately provokes the Southern Church to enter Shanghai the following year to begin the MEC South mission as well. And we'll talk about that in our next session.